Okay, so this is a friendly match of 1805 cores between the Royal Cravates and RHB. I'm technically playing against my own clan here. I'm Bellegarde, the 10-pointer. We have Buxhoeveden, the 12-pointer. In the rear is Mack, and then supported by a Bagration Cav corps. Against us is Ney up front, here on the hill, and then in the back is Soult, Lannes, and Bernadotte. This map's kind of interesting because Imperial actually have terrain advantage and arguably lock advantage. They have this nice ridgeline that they can utilize their speed and fast guns to get a pretty favorable position. This 4-pointer here is almost impossible to attack if you try to actually contest it as Imperial. If you know, it'll be pretty easy to spot a slow coalition army making its way to pressure this 4-pointer. So that makes Ney's job here important to scout the right, so that way he can know if he needs to move his infantry along this ridge and make a defensive line. As coalition, you would be attacking literally uphill across an open plain the entire time, and you're moving away from your own reinforcements, which more or less could utilize this road network here to make it to the front lines. So it's not really an ideal situation to attack the left, despite it sort of having an open look to it. If you attack the center, you still have the same exact ridgeline to have to attack into, but now you're attacking, again, still uphill for no actual gain, and you're pressuring this front player into the French reserves. So at some point, you'll hit the top of the ridge, you'll stall, and then you're going to get basically Austerlitz or something. Now, the right is not exactly that great, but the broken terrain can offer some, defense against artillery. Not every single area would be ideal for French guns, despite them having this sort of broken terrain here. And then, the houses are back here. The 4-pointer is at least all in this wooded area. So should you get pushed here and the coalition makes it there faster, it'd be kind of hard for Imperial to kind of still make it through all of this terrain and make a decisive melee attack. And you get this nice road network all the way to it. So that's more or less why we chose to try and hold this 4 on the right. It keeps our internal lines of communication using this road network. We're already weighted to the right because of how the rear deploys. And, if you were to try and push the left, there's not really that much there. So if the Imperial decides to, come over here and attack from this direction, there is literally nothing on the map between here. So if you look, what is there to gain from an Imperial attack there? They would just be coming into our reserves, and then they would still have to attack this house. And we would have internal lines still to move it around in this road network. So right now you can see that we're in mid-advance. I'll go ahead and start playing it. For something like this, obviously scouting would be really important because we have basically 2 armies forward deployed and then an opposing frontally deployed army. We don't know where their reserves will appear. They don't know where our reserves will appear. For Coalition, it's more important to know where your reserves need to go because they're slower. Mack, if I remember correctly, this army is mostly L3, L2. With a couple L4 elements, which means that you can't really recombine it quickly with whatever else we have. The Austrians up here, I brought a mostly L4 army built around the Legion Infernal, and then some really high shooting stat grenadiers, and then the L2 brigades are just decent stats. Buxhoeveden is basically L4 using the various Russian brigades, and then also brought the Kaiser Franz. Our cav is actually quite good, lots of horse guns to support it. As you can see, the French are already scouting the right, and like I said, it's important for them to know if infantry is coming down the road, because they'll need to either defend the fort or defend this fort. We were trying to make enough of a cav screen that they wouldn't be able to see us. This is a misplay by Buxhoeveden because all of his scout cav is this far ahead to his right. he needed something at least one here to kind of screen his army so we aren't going to be seen or spotted by this light cav. I have to make the choice to run a cav here and try and push him back so that way he doesn't know where our armies are deploying. Bagration's light cav and horse guns are already almost to the front lines. As you can see, it's not actually that far for us. And then we actually have a general advance by Ney into this forested area, or out of the forested area, and down from the hill. So one thing we didn't know was that this whole area slows. This big green patch is all slowing. You can tell because the artillery is just crawling, even though it's F5. That actually becomes incredibly important later on, that we have this terrain knowledge that this area is a slowing debuff. Coalition survives based on slowing down the tempo of the game, and having terrain that actually slows the enemy was obviously a boon for that. So at this point, we told Bagration to actually, Buxhoeveden, to actually come more centrally, because we saw that Ney was moving himself out of position, and we were going to have him essentially at a right angle, if you see how the road networks combine here. This lack of scouting in the center is actually really hurtful to Coalition, because we literally have no idea what is here. This entire area is unscouted. Some horse guns here deployed to try and see off his cavalry, which does work. I don't think we inflicted any losses on him, but you know, the threat of having your cav aggressively attacked by artillery is what you really need to be doing with horse guns. Right here is basically like a small meeting engagement. Both of us have not really committed a lot here. It's more or less trying to figure out what the intention is. Some nice French guns here, using their hill. From this position you can pretty much hit anything. I think they actually skipped the rounds into the ground here a little bit, due to some unknown error, but yeah. So Buxhoeven's whole advance is not scouted here. The Kazaki are, though. The problem is he's advancing an army in this type of formation into what's probably an enemy formation, but without any scouting. So we have no idea what's here, you know? So if you're going to make an attack, you really need to know what you're walking into. Otherwise, it could be him walking into 3 corps. Overall, we have, you know, light cav play on both sides, trying to hem in the flanks, which we have pretty wide flanks. There's Kazaki all the way on the left, and we have Gusari all the way on the right, supported by Kazaki, facing off the French Hussars and Chevaliers. Sorry, Chasseurs au Cheval.
This building has fallen to the enemy.
This was a mistake. Buxhoeveden kind of misread what we wanted him to do in terms of deployment. He's actually moving away from me instead of towards me. Like, he should have been taking this road for a quick redeployment. But it's okay. Now we have the Kazakis scouting in the center. They're hidden, and more or less, this kind of tells us that there's actually nothing here. Like, at least to this tree line. We have Bavarian reserves over this way. We managed to slip a Kazaki around them. More Bavarian horse guns. And then Imperial troops finally arriving at this one pointer here. Which is a little worrying. It means that, you know, the rest of the army can't be far behind. These are obviously the L6 light infantry, so somewhere around here should be a lot more infantry. It's not like the rest of the French army in 1805 is that much slower. Most of it's, you know, L5. These Bavarian guns here are in a good position to kind of check any advance out of from me towards them here in the center. So this is where Buxhoeveden makes his correction, starts coming more centrally. This is also a misplay by Mack. He saw the, you know, French units over on the left, thought we needed to kind of defend our left flank, but like I said at the beginning, there's nothing really here to defend. If we needed our left flank tied in, we have this nice lock position here. Really, he needs to have been right here in my reserve. French light cav making a little bit of a play on the flank here. And also on this flank here, supported by infantry. It's a good way to maximize your cav play, is to always have some squarables or light infantry supporting it. Supported cav will always beat unsupported cav. So now that Buxhoeven's here, I advance with the Legion Infernal. We kind of wanted to try and gain a little bit of territory before the French reserves started showing up, but at this point it's kind of apparent that that's not going to happen, because more and more units start appearing behind the lines. Their generals are already here. And then lots of French cav appear on our flank. And now the French army. So at this point, this is more or less guaranteed to be either Soult or Lannes. It's a very big army that's about to appear on our flank. We had been directing our attack this direction.
Our men are running for.
Lannes is coming, or Lannes and Soult are coming on this axis of attack. That's firmly into Buxhoeven's flank. My artillery gets sniped. It's only 3-pounders, but you know, it's helpful. At this point, Buxhoeveden needs to deploy to face this huge threat. Not to mention this cross-supported threat. Some French cav getting wiped on the far flank. Since we have spotted the French army here, again, this is why scouting is really important. We basically walked blind into Soult. We redeploy, or I redeploy, my reserves to take over the left of Buxhoeveden. At this point, the Bavarian player here, I believe it's Ney, should have re-engaged with his infantry on this axis while Soult was advancing on this axis. Because our reinforcements are this far away. They have 3 corps at a minimum here. We have 2 corps supported by, you know, a partial cav corps. These guns get absolutely massacred. This is where a concentration of force probably would have been helpful. They could have just walked forward at this point instead of stretching out. And this right here is chaos. Redeploying like this in front of the enemy, especially a fast enemy, you should never do. And more reserves in the rear. So that's the Walther Dragoon Division. It looks scary, but the stats are only okay. It has a very specific role, and it doesn't always get the value out of it. But it's a scary looking unit. So we have a pretty wide flank here. This cav is pretty much powerless to do anything against these. There's absolutely no way they can do any damage against squareable L6s.
Our men are running, sir.
Light cav gets sniped over here. Okay, so now we have the main French attack is very obviously telegraphed here. Big infantry reserves, the Dragoons division in the center coming to attack, obviously this Russian element here. We do not have our reserves in place to kind of stop this type of attack. The heavy cav is all the way back here. That's no good. A solid line of infantry with almost no spacing, with more infantry being pushed into the spaces that you need for your cavalry. And then on the flanks, more cav that's really not going to be able to do much to counterattack. Now being said, this right here was probably a misplay. Getting this close, even to bad Russian shooters, you're just gonna get massacred. So, Walther Dragoons have come in. Got a square here. Infantry is following up. Mack is still pretty far away from being able to help us. This is a bad position. We have, for sure, 3, maybe 4 corps against us. Now the fact that these units broke was a little surprising to me. I'm in square with Legion Infernal. A little bit of fin there. These horse guns on the flank, the unattended flank here, just ripping through French lines.
Our men are running for
The Walther Dragoons are retreating, having done their job. But this follow-up here, and all of this cavalry here, should be following up the Walther Dragoons. And same with, here's another cav push in the center. Everything should be marching forward for the French. Instead, you have lots and lots of reserves still here in the rear, probably because there's all of this cav to their flank. But still, you've ruptured the center. You can pretty much ignore this cavalry that's too far away to actually help stabilize this line here. Those guns are really putting in work, just blasting holes through the French lines. At this point, we are just trying to survive.
now they must break.
A lucky snipe back here, not paying attention while their micro is stretched. So they have an entire 4th Corps here. This is where the 4th Bavarian Corps is in the reserve. So cav getting blasted here in the center. They're not even engaged, they're just standing next to it. This is where micro getting stretched becomes a thing. Buxhoeven's micro also stretched. He's trying to make a counterattack on the right, supported by these horse guns, but our center is looking quite dark. Now, this is a significant amount of French troops, but they don't have any space between their lines to try and push with their cavalry advantage. If you notice, like half of my army is L2 here, my front line is L2 with no squares. These troops trying to retreat, you could easily run them down with cav. Same with the Russians, almost no squares, lots of friendlies routing nearby. That's when the cavalry really needs to be doing something. Walther beating up on Russian dragoons. Mack arriving on our flank. This sort of stabilizes our left and allows me to reform the center. Now we still have lots going on here.
The men are fatigued, sir, and must rest a while.
At this point, it's trying to get as much of the Russians out of this sort of encirclement that we're in. Build up our reserves back to let them rest, because they're coming back, they need to be able to rest. And then also not get the Austrians caught. All of this reserve should just... They could have just kept pressing the advantage, but I think they were a little leery on advancing even more. Horse guns putting in work. This is, again, where things get, choppy. You have units trying to withdraw, units standing still that are forgotten about. All of this ground slows, so we're trying to retreat over slowing ground. And here comes the cav. Mack is simultaneously trying to relieve pressure on the left. But this is a very deep reserve. And a lot of guns. Like, what do you do against that? Over here, Buxhoeveden is still surviving. Our units are still intermingled, which is a major, like, issue when you're just trying to command your own forces. These sort of overlaps make it really difficult to micro your armies because you just can't figure out which ones are which. You end up shooting friendlies in the back, things like that. Mack gets lucky here. They don't pursue further. And realizes that this is not an attackable position. Some more cav action over here. Dragoons. An elite Kitasu against the Walther Dragoons. This is where, you know, mass and stats and things like that really favor an elite unit like this. We have the Russian Horse Grand Battery over here. Not to mention, it's supported by infantry. And like I said earlier, supported cav, always better than unsupported cav. What they're doing with these reserves, I'm not sure. Maybe they thought there was a bigger threat on their flank. But our center is looking quite thin. This is where their main axis of attack should be going. Life Care to City again. Chevalier is just instantly getting wrecked. Now, the terrain slowing is exactly what we wanted here. It basically will make it so their pursuit is harder and harder for them to get into melee with us at this point, which is what we want as coalition, for them to be stuck into shooting. Especially with units like the Spaleni and these Grenadiers. If I remember, like, the Strasserado has like 29 accuracy or something ridiculous like that. Some Austrians were sacrificed.
Our men are running, sir.
So this is the part where we've actually started to stabilize. Their reserves are stretching out more when they shouldn't be. They should have been concentrating more here centrally, and then making an advance along this axis with their artillery and support. But now they're drawing themselves closer to our guns, letting us stand and shoot at them, which plays into our favor again. We have a fresh Kaiser Franz here, and then the Dragoner Hohenlohe, and Pontifex, and then City Mack. This big horse gun battery just ripping apart this flank here. So now this area is weak for the Imperials, and we have a much bigger reserve of infantry here. Obviously there's still a threat in the center, where they're congregating all of their resources, but we figured it's time to counterattack on both flanks. The idea was to try to pinch through on both sides, to draw their micro and control away, make sure they become disorganized instead of us, and that way they can't launch an attack through the center. Mack still has decent reserves over here. We're able to basically pour in point-blank volleys into these light infantry that got caught here. Counterattack from Cav. Canister debuffing. So now again, we're gonna try the same attack now that they're shifting centrally. Big reserves again here. The Russians are actually stabilized on our right. The weakest part of our line is here. We have a pretty strong position over here, and heavy cav ready to go. We were trying to get one more cannon shot, but the guns just didn't fire for some reason. This unit does not square. It's the only non-squaring unit it appears, which is good for us. On this flank, general Russian advance. So again, now we're in the part where you can kind of force the Imperial to do what you want, which is we want them to make one more counterattack. Because now they're getting desperate. They're getting pushed back. And here comes one of those types of attacks. Absolutely massacre that unit. Heavy Cav's now attacking. They're running out of manpower.
Our men are running, sir.
Dragoons going in over here. This is where micro starts to get stretched. You have multiple different attacks going on. So you can catch units that normally would square out of square. Russian light dragoons, sorry. Putting in work on the flank. Failed charge from the Russians there. This is what happens if you tired infantry charging. So now we have a pretty solid advantage in terms of both positioning and numerically. This pocket here is basically destined to die at this point. There's not much you can do. They can't retreat because we have cav superiority at this point in this area. And if they try to walk away, the ground is slowing enough that they can't retreat. They can't attack either because the ground is slowing and we have numerical advantage. So it's just finishing off this pocket. And the retreating units coming through their reserves is really going to try and play havoc with what you have available, forming lines, things like that. Plus all this light cav is constantly harassing their rear. And then this army still is here pinning nice chunky infantry.
Our men are running, sir.
Spaleni. And that's basically it. There was probably that point right around here where when they had those massive cav reserves and the Russians were disoriented and trying to retreat, and the Austrians over here were mixed in with retreating Russians and routing Russians, that a full advance of their reserves and that cavalry that was behind probably would have won them the game. We got away because they didn't pursue vigorously enough, and then that played into our hands once they got into the slowing zone, and the front line stabilized. We were able to rest, get into a shooting fight, and then counterattack as we saw fit from both flanks around their main centralized push. Because you could tell that they still were trying to make this central axis advance, but that put them into a pocket here that we were able to nip from both sides. Especially once they gave up this flank over here. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, we can watch the rest of these units crumble, but from a strategic point, this game is, you know, over. But it was fairly close. I think if either side could have lost or won the battle at any given point, which makes it an interesting game, it really comes down to Buxhoeveden not initially scouting this sort of flank here, and Soult coming in to basically eat him for breakfast. I think had Ney come off from here at the same time that Soult was advancing on this axis, we wouldn't have been able to redeploy our reserves. Mack was way in the rear, and then they would have had 3 versus 2, 2.5 with the cav corps. Not enough infantry to hold back all of that cav and Soult and Lannes. Meanwhile, you know, the fact that we were able to escape that, basically, and then form a new line, rest, and then make a counterattack is where we were able to flip the game. If we hadn't been able to get to that point, obviously, we were just chain routed along the line. If they had pursued a little bit more vigorously with the cav. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.